let's see how it goes.
Awesome.
We will improvise if needs be.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for joining. I will be probably letting more people in there's moments because people will be joining, I'm sure. But I'll start with a small admin announcement and we'll kick off. So how we'll spend this time? I expect it to be around 45-50 minutes for conversation between myself and Paulo. And after that, we will take around 10-15 minutes to address the questions that you have. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I will be monitoring it. And I would either weave them in if it is relevant to what we are discussing, or I will then leave them for the ending of this conversation. So just a small admin stuff, and we're ready to kick in. I met Paulo in one of the leadership communities, and since then we were interacting in the social media and think we have quite similar views on the leadership and coaching. And it was a pleasure for him, for us to have him today with us to talk about his experience of doing coaching and doing coaching from the side of not a professional coach, but a manager, a professional who uses coaching skills. And this is very important because I myself sometimes have this blurred eye because I'm kind of too professionalized myself as a coach. And for me, it's hard to understand how hard it may be for managers who don't have hundreds of hours of training on coaching, how hard it may be for them to implement it. So I'm happy to have people like Paulo coming in and sharing their view on coaching and how they can do it in a practical way for a busy leader, for a seasoned leader like himself. So without further ado, Paulo, welcome. And would you briefly introduce yourself?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me, Alex. I think this is an important conversation, not just this specific one, but the broader conversation around coaching. I think we don't talk about coaching enough, especially, not in tech companies where there's a lot of push to do things and get stuff done and move forward and, and be successful as businesses. But I don't think we talk nearly enough about coaching and the benefits of coaching and what you can get from that. Thanks also everyone who dialed in and joined the conversation. I hope we have plenty of time for everyone to ask questions and to participate in the discussion actively. As for me, I've been in tech for a little over 15 years now. Most of that was spent in a number of software developer roles. More recently, I've been living in Berlin in a company called HelloFresh, where I eventually became a director of engineering there. And then I moved to Vienna, where I was for the last couple of years as a VP of engineering for a company called TourRadar, an online marketplace for multi-day tours. And since the end of March, I've actually been enjoying some time off. I've since come back to Berlin. And one of the things I've been doing is precisely a very interesting experience for me, which has been helping, through coaching and mentoring a number of people in the tech industry over the last few months. And so we'll probably get into some examples of that and some specifics of that in our conversation. And in the meantime, I'm also quietly looking for my next full-time job, which, it's a whole different experience in and of itself. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. Thanks, Paul. So let's take the plunge. So what's coaching for you?
I don't know that I have, a definition, like a crisp dictionary-like definition of coaching, but I do think that coaching needs to start from the premise of fundamentally believing in the potential of people, right? Of course, everyone is going to have a different level of ultimate potential. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but everyone has a certain potential, and more often than not, that potential is way above where everyone thinks it is, including the person themselves. And so when we think about coaching, what is, to me, I think the idea that resonates the most kind of comes from, Timothy Galway, which I'm sure you know, Alex, and the author of The Inner Game of Tennis. You have potential and you want to get to performance, and the difference there is interference, right? What is interfering in people reaching the potential that they have? And that's the role of the coach, and that's the role of coaching, is removing that interference. I think it's helping the person understand where their potential lies and having a sort of a guided discovery on how to get there. That can take a long time. That can be more focused, more short term, but ultimately I think the idea is to remove interference. And what is this interference I'm talking about? Sometimes it's self-doubt, sometimes it's fear, sometimes it's a lack of context, it's focusing on maybe not the right things, getting distracted with this and that. All of those things are interference that get in the way of high performance and fulfillment and happiness of the individual.
Yeah, you mentioned.
So,
yeah,
I guess the other thing I would say is that the coach's role is to understand. Sorry, say again.
You mentioned interference, and I today was coaching one director client of mine, and he was talking about doing something, and I asked him, "Is it possible for you to delegate it?" And he answered something like, "Obviously not." And I said, "Why obviously?" And he thought, this was his interference,
Exactly.
thing that he took for granted.
Exactly, and it can be so many things. And again, I think the role of the coach is to not to fix things, not to solve things for the person, but to really facilitate the best thinking of whoever, and is really to understand. So personally, I think everyone should have a coach. Obviously, this is not practical, but I do think everyone would benefit, and every team, every company would benefit from coaching, because honestly, I think that the downsides of that are little to none, and the upside can be very massive. And I think there's a lot of people that unfortunately don't reach their potential, and I think coaching has definitely a role to play in that.
So how you then will distinguish between having, let's say, a professional coach, someone coming, I don't know, externally or internally from the company, but doing specifically coaching, or having your manager as a coach?
That's a good question. And to me, it's a bit hard to answer that question, because to be quite honest, I don't think I was ever exposed to really top-notch professional coaching so far in my career. So I don't have really this comparison kind of way of looking at that question. What I can say though is that from a manager perspective, and I've been a manager for now a number of years, is that coaching is, again, the difference between people living much closer to their potential or not being anywhere near that, right? I think there's also a point here to make, maybe it's a bit of a sidestepping your question, but the difference between coaching and mentoring, I think it's probably important to bring into the conversation. And coming back to your point about professional coaching, I think coaching tends to be a lot more, from a time frame perspective, more short term rather than long term. It's more focused on performance, on getting better at a certain skill perhaps, whereas mentoring is more long-term development driven, and coaching tends to be more structured, right? I think your experience probably says the same. It's more structured, whereas the mentoring relationship is more, a bit all over the place. It's more based on the experience of the mentor, and the mentee tends to drive the conversation more, whereas the coach is more pragmatic, or should be perhaps more pragmatic, and drive the conversation. One thing I also will say to your question is that companies would benefit from having coaching, especially at the leadership team level. I think that's super important, because the benefits that accrue from that and the leadership team working better as a team, they kind of roll downhill, right? And the rest of the organization can benefit from that in multiple ways. So I think, again, definitely from my side, I haven't really been exposed to what really top-notch professional coaching looks like. But I do think I have seen on the ground, and we can explore some of those examples, how a coaching approach to management can yield, massive benefits.
Okay. So would you like to discuss any of those examples, any stories?
Yeah, so obviously there's good and not so good stories, right? I can give you a quick couple of examples of perhaps a positive one, or a couple of positive ones and a couple of not so great ones. So in one of the companies that I worked with more recently, as I was discovering where the organization was and how things were, what the status quo was, and I was getting to know everyone, There was clearly one individual that was more senior in the team and definitely could help me then address the issues that the company had and scaling the team up, et cetera, et cetera. But I realized that his strong suit was very much the technical side. And so then, you know, the people relationships, the process, the product, and also the business acumen, if you will, wasn't really there too much. And there wasn't even perhaps the perception that that was important. But, you know, when someone is coachable, things are easier. And so with this person over a number of months, more than a year, we built that relationship, and this person became, you know, a lot better from all of those perspectives. And ultimately, you know, the proof is in the outcome where he has, you know, top tier tech firms looking for him to join their organizations as well, because he became a very well-rounded individual. And I think that's an example where, as long as someone is coachable and understands that there's more than one pillar to being, you know, a strong engineering leader, coaching again over time can definitely be a way to get there.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be one example. I had another example of someone actually in the same company that came to me and said, I want to be an engineering manager, right? And I think that was also a coaching opportunity, and that's also perhaps a positive example of that, where I felt like I had. This person was, by the way, a senior developer on sort of the infrastructure and systems engineering side. He wanted to be an engineering manager. And so through different conversations and regular one-on-ones, we picked apart why he wanted to be an engineering manager. And then it turns out that it was not really being an engineering manager. He wanted to have certain responsibilities and have the opportunity of focusing on certain areas to develop himself and things that were a calling for him that his current role was not allowing him to do. So where does the coaching come in? The coaching came in first of all, understanding that there was this difference. But then at the same time, once we got to an agreement on, okay, these are the areas where we can invest and focus on, that's where I then started working with him and tried to help him improve in all of those things. So I think a coach also brings kind of an idea of trying to bring awareness of what does good look like in certain areas, and then help the person take the necessary steps to get there or close.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I can also give you the bad example. I think earlier in my career, definitely I had a couple of very, you know, bad missteps. I say bad because, you know, things move on, but, you know, I had two female engineers in my team that the problem was not having a coaching approach. It was my coaching approach was not the right one, right? And I couldn't really figure out, and I didn't have the patience perhaps out of my own inexperience, where past a certain obvious improvement in their skill sets at various levels, I couldn't really, you know, continue on from there, and it was entirely my fault, and I just didn't have the patience or the right long-term approach with them. Yeah, and ultimately this is something that I wasn't happy about with myself, because we know how important it is to have, you know, more strong female leadership, especially in tech companies. And back then I didn't do a good job in leading these people, and the good news is that it was a good learning experience for me, and, you know, hopefully that's reflected in the future with better examples.
And it's interesting, what do you think was kind of the main ingredient that in some cases it worked and in some it didn't work?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think in this case, I again put it mostly on me. I think I didn't yet have myself the experience to and the patience that comes with that experience. And I was being their manager as well, probably a little bit too results driven for the rhythm and the pace that they needed at the time. And so, again, I think the responsibility there is mine. Likewise, in the successful cases, I think I did have, probably learning from that, I did have more of that patience and that experience to understand the pace that people needed. You know, and ultimately also some people are more coachable than others. That's also the reality. But I think I had more tools in my toolbox, let's say later on in my career and more recently than I had in the past. And so I guess that didn't help then, and it helps to be more successful now.
You seem to be mentioning a lot coachability, and what do you mean by that?
Well, I think coachability comes, I would say, essentially from self-awareness. I think self-awareness is definitely a foundational attribute that we need to be able to evolve, to develop ourselves, to understand where our gaps are, where we need to get better. And I think the people that weren't very coachable in my teams, I think you know, upon reflection, it always boils down to a large extent to that lack of self-awareness. And to be quite honest, I don't think this is an easy thing by any means to develop in people. I think it's something that either ultimately you have or you don't. And you can definitely work on that over a long period of time. Unfortunately, I think in tech companies, everything moves so fast, and the time frames, and you look at the tenures of people, you know, someone stays 2 years in a company, they're kind of the exception. They're not the rule. You know, at least in the types of companies that I've worked for in the past. And so with that in mind, it's like changing our personality, right? It's like changing our character and the foundational things about it. It takes a long time, but it requires that self-awareness. So I think that would be the main ingredient of coachability, and then obviously some degree of humility and some degree of growth mindset, this belief that you can learn anything, that you can get better. And I think people who, you know, start learning more and more and become more experienced, they also realize that there's way more things out there that they don't know. So the more they know, the more they realize what they don't know. And I think that gives them a degree of humility that makes them more and more coachable, and so more and more, you know, accessible to get to their potential. I think those would be the types of things, like self-awareness, humility, and a growth mindset, kind of like the building blocks of coachability in my mind.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. How do you go about figuring out whether a particular person is coachable or not? Do you try several sessions, or what's your approach?
So can you just repeat the question, because the video
yeah.
broke down in the audio?
Yeah, how do you figure out
How do I go about it?
The
person is coachable. Okay. So I think, again, as a manager, because I'm not talking from the perspective of a professional coach, I'm not that, but as a manager, I think it always starts with building trust and building a relationship with the people in your team, right? And I think part of that trust and building the relationship is, number one, to care about them, and number two, to understand what motivates them. What is their intrinsic motivation, right? You know, people, for different reasons, they may be in a place of their lives where they're optimizing for making more money, and I cannot judge them for that. Now you may say, well, they would benefit from being coached to actually, you know, accomplishing those goals. But the reality is that there's situations where it's not really about coaching. It's about, you know, going out there, interviewing, getting the highest offer, and then moving on from there. And I can't judge people for that. But ultimately, I think people, when they have what I like to call a career narrative, where they understand where they are and what moves them, what is their intrinsic motivation, and a lot of that is developing themselves, is a thirst for learning. It's a thirst for understanding, how do I get better? And importantly, how do I help others getting better? I think that indicates, it's a very good proxy in my experience for coachability, because they will be open to grow. They want to grow. They understand that they're still at, you know, level 1, level 2, whatever the case may be, but there's 10 other levels to get to. 20 never ends. And I think you see this through conversation. You start to realize, again, where their motivation lies, and you start agreeing on certain long-term goals for them, and you see who's in and who's not on that. And then on a daily basis, on a weekly basis, you see, are we making progress or not? Are we on the same page or not? And I think all of those things tend to go, you feel like you're going not against the grain when someone is coachable. That's what I feel.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So basically you you assess it on how they respond to being coached, as far as I can.
Yeah, and how motivated they are about that relationship. Do they see, do I feel like they see that relationship as, a nice to have, or actually for them a must have, because they see it as a leverage to become better, to take themselves to the next level and to the next level. A lot of this is gut feeling, to be quite honest. I don't think you can put a number to this. I don't think you should. A lot of it is gut feeling, and you see how people go for the opportunities that, again, startups have a lot of opportunity. My own history is a succession of things that were there to do and opportunities that were there to grab, and going for it. And if I had more access to coaching and mentoring, I would definitely have gone for it, because I will take whatever I can to help me along that journey. And I think it becomes quite clear when people have that drive.
Mm-hmm. I think it makes sense to ask this question from the audience that we received about, because you mentioned coachability, relationship. I think these are important ingredients. So the question was about how do you coach an introvert, and
Yeah.
the question about being more positive and relaxed attitude on a stress project.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Whoever asked the question. Well, I think there's a couple of things to begin with. Number one is, does this person want to be in this position that this person finds themselves in, right? I think there's that. I think very often it happens that people, for whatever reason, find themselves in positions that they either don't want to be, and then, don't find a right way or a comfortable way of saying no, or they don't understand what the expectation of being in that position actually looks like. But when we think about an introvert person, I consider myself largely an introvert. I think it's more complicated than that. But if we go back to the idea of interference, introversion is not the interference, in my opinion. So to answer the question, how do you coach someone that is an introvert? You need to remove interference as much as possible, as we already talked about. But the introversion bit is not the interference. The interference is what is making specifically this person not comfortable, despite being an introvert, or because of being an introvert, right? So what is making the project stressful, for example, if it's, going back to the question that you sent over to me, what is making the project stressful? Introverts have certain strong suits. For example, I don't like to, I'm not very good at thinking on my feet in front of people and so on and so forth. I like to take my time to reason about something and then put something, thought out together, maybe in writing. How can I, as a manager of this person, help this person create the conditions to play more to her strengths, rather than be in a position that just is completely at odds with with being an introvert, right? So I think there's all of these things that we need to pick apart. Once again, there needs to be a relationship of trust with the person being coached. And again, clarifying expectations. Do we understand what the role is? What the objectives are? Do other people around you understand, or do you know what they expect from you? I'll give you an example. Someone I've started coaching recently. He's a team lead in an engineering team, but he has this or had this idea that he had to be, more senior than anybody else and needs to write better code than anybody else, when the reality is, as a team lead, that's not exactly the types of things that are required of him, right? And so I think the coach has a role here to walk through and to do this, what I call this guided discovery of what the context is, what the reality is, and perhaps reframe some of those things. So I think, again, the core would be get to know the person, get to know the context, and then help the person by asking questions that aim at understanding what is their understanding of the situation, and then working through the difficulties, whatever nature they are, together.
Yeah, I agree. And without trust, without really caring for them, there's not much chance that this coaching would be really successful.
Absolutely. Trust is the bedrock of any successful relationship, coaching or no coaching.
And it's interesting because I think what was presupposed in this question, that coaching is about making somebody more, or changing people in a way I want them to be different, and coaching doesn't work like that.
Exactly. And I think that's not the best way to go about it, because at the end of the day, you cannot change people. You can change yourself, or you can change the environment. And I think part of the environment in some sort of meta way is for people, how people perceive their environment as well. So if you change the perception of the challenges, but also if you make changes perhaps to the perception of the role, and again, what the expectations are, I think that can be a game changer without changing the person. The person is not going to become an extrovert, certainly not overnight, certainly not for this one project. Because that's what you, at least maybe that's your understanding of what an effective leader or an effective project leader looks like.
Yeah. And again, if they are not very positive in the stressful situation, it seems like about what kind of toolbox of coping strategies they have. Exactly. And if you don't go deeper and explore it, then probably you won't find a proper one. Or maybe even this person would like to have a different approach, but they just don't have the flexibility as of now.
Exactly. And by the way, I don't think a coach is a therapist. I think those are two very different things, but I do think there's in many cases a certain overlap, because a lot of the time interference is also people don't have a sounding board. People have really no one that they can talk to about their challenges, however menial they might look like or feel like. And so I think the coach also has that role of being that sounding board, not necessarily reflecting anything back, but listening, and then gathering information and understanding him or herself to be in a better position to continue the process and continue removing that interference, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. So coming back to what you mentioned about coaching, mentoring, distinction between them, and maybe for me, it's always interesting to explore what is not coaching. So if you, for example, as a manager, if you use coaching approach, what would be an opposite of that? What would be coaching who is not using, a manager who's not using coaching?
Well, unfortunately, I think I can say this with a high degree of confidence. Most managers are actually not using coaching in the relationship with their direct reports. And the simplest example, but also I think the most common, is just focusing on projects, metrics, progress, status updates, et cetera, which works to a certain extent, tends to elicit compliance and not necessarily motivation. Mm-hmm. And compliance only goes so far, right? And that definitely doesn't scale. I think, one of the biggest issues of scaling companies is really when managers don't realize that they're not scaling themselves. And a big part of that is that they continue to look at doing the work and not so much doing the work that makes the work work. And I know this is a bit confusing, but what I mean by this is, how do we create the conditions for everybody else to do a great job, right? What is that work, right? It may take many different things. It might be, let's be do effective retrospectives, for example. How do we as a team improve? What is one thing we can do better next week than we did the week before, and really own that and take accountability for that. Also on the one-on-one relationship. But again, back to your question, I think it's really about just focusing on the actual work and not focusing enough on the people that are doing the work and the teams that are doing the work. Mm-hmm. It can be as simple as in, how are you doing? How is everything at home? How often is this question forgotten actually in a one-on-one? Mm-hmm. Because immediately is what's going on with project A, B, or C, because me as a manager, I also have to respond to my manager or to the CEO or whatever the case may be. And there's all of this push to do the work and not enough to do the work that makes the work work. And a lot of that is really with people and understanding, okay, what is getting in the way of this person being at their full potential for as long as possible? in a sustainable way, right? So at best, you have a gigantic waste of potential because you're not getting the best out of your people, even though on the day-to-day you have the illusion that you do, because there's this immediate and short-term progress that you see. The longer term, as you know, for us human beings, it's a lot harder to understand. And we only understand sometimes when it's, very often when it's too late. And at worst, you're going to get people that, you know, are disgruntled and disenfranchised and are unhappy and can become toxic for the rest of the team. And you're none the wiser because you're not looking at those things. You are looking just at the progress of projects. And then if, you know, teams don't deliver, then we have a delivery problem and management that trusts the teams. And, you know, there's a lot of things that I think could have been addressed proactively by understanding that these are people that are building technology, and the technology doesn't build itself. It's not just about the technology itself or the products or the business. It's really about the people. Yeah. So if you're lucky, people will seek their coaches and mentors somewhere else, not from their manager. And if you're unlucky, they won't, and they will just linger and, you know, usually get to bad places and bring others down with them. And that's not good for anyone.
The way I'm getting it, my interpretation is that treating people as a full kind of person, not just a cog in a wheel who does their function.
Yeah, and look, there's many companies that are successful by churning through a lot of people, because from the point of view of the company is a story, right? The company, we are flesh and bone. We can, now with the coronavirus, there's not too much touching, right? But we're real, supposedly, but the company is not real. And what I mean by this is that the company exists and exists through time, and people come and go. And there's definitely cultures where, you know, people tend to stay a lot longer because there's this, they identify with the mission, they are treated accordingly, and they want to stick around because it's a good thing for them, for their development, but also for their purpose, their values, and so on. And you have other companies that, you know, you look from the outside and they're definitely successful. You cannot argue with, you know, market caps and, you know, run rates and all of those business metrics, right? But the reality is that to get there, they have churned through a lot of people, and you look at their average tenures and they're very low, and they just keep, you know, hiring to replace and hiring more and more. And that's a way to do it. But I guess everyone has to figure out where they want to be.
Yeah. And I think it builds nicely to the next question from the audience, because you mentioned how you kind of just, for example, ask, how are you on a one-on-one? So the question is, do you set a specific time for coaching your employees? And do you let your employees know that they are being coached?
Yeah, it's a great question. First of all, coaching happens all the time. There's no time specific for coaching. Sure, there is, in my opinion, any manager should have a regular one-on-one with their direct reports, and that can have, you know, whatever rules about it. Is maybe it's every week on the same day and the same time. Usually that's how people do it. Certainly it's how I do it, so it's predictable. But ultimately the act of coaching, I think, happens at any point. And what I mean by this is that there's any situation, almost any situation inside a company and during the day-to-day of a team and an individual in a company is a coaching opportunity. So for example, if you're in a meeting and you happen to be in a meeting with your manager, there's probably something out of that could be improved. And so what I'm getting at here, obviously, it's feedback, right? And I think feedback is a form of coaching as well. Feedback needs to be actionable, needs to be timely. So don't leave it for, you know, the next one-on-one that maybe happens in 1 or 2 weeks. Say it now, and that's a coaching opportunity. Because ultimately, where we're coming back to is how can we be the best version of ourselves, right? And that has no time and no place. We're constantly in motion, doing things, interacting with others, doing all sorts of team and company activities. So I don't think there's a time and place for that. I think the one-on-ones are key, but coaching is a mindset. And do I tell people that I'm coaching them? I think not necessarily, right? Because at the end of the day, there's no need to kind of peek behind the curtain. I think the point is I care for you and I care for your growth and I care for the company's growth, and we need to keep both aligned. Again, I'm coming from the perspective of a manager coach, right? So I have a responsibility for the company and the business, and I have a responsibility for everyone in my charge, and that is to keep those growth trajectories aligned, and that happens at any time.
Mm-hmm. I'll allow you answer, because that's basically what I usually tell people, because it's hard to be a coach only when you, I don't know, in a conference room or on a call and you do one-on-one and then step out of the room and you are not a coach anymore. So you either coach them all the time or probably you don't. But I guess sometimes it could be an interesting case when for example, you're trying to kind of switch your style from being more directive and being more strict to be coaching, and maybe in these kind of cases it makes sense to let people know that something different will be coming.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's just this led to another question: how often do I have one-on-one? So just quickly, I think again the answer is it depends. It depends on a few things. It depends on usually the level of seniority and experience of the people in my team and my direct reports. Ultimately, with my directs, I try to have every week a one-on-one, again, at a specific day of the week and a specific time. And actually have also, by the way, a shared agenda that we collaborate with in between sessions, so that we hopefully are always talking about the things that matter the most, again, for the person to do a great job. People that are not my direct reports, depending on the number of indirect reports that I have, but I try to have, every couple of weeks, go to lunch. Usually it's a very good thing to do on a skip level basis. So with not my direct reports, but the ones reporting to them. So I would say if you can, if possible, best would be every week, if not bi-weekly. Other than that, I think it starts to be a little bit too long unless you keep, the communication going, Slack, etc. At the end of the day, you're always communicating most of the time, at least. So, but yeah, the short answer would be weekly as much as possible, and then just an ongoing open channel.
So is there any topic that we didn't cover and you wanted to cover? Maybe there is something that you wanted to bring into this conversation.
Well, that's a good question. I think we covered definitely the essentials of it, the fundamentals. I think I would probably redirect the question to our audience and use the time like that. What do you think?
Then the last one from myself, and
okay,
take the question. So how did you develop yourself as a coach? So what did you do to become a better coach?
Yeah, I think, first, I think it starts with the understanding of the benefits of coaching that we have addressed at length already in this conversation. I'm someone that learns a lot from reading. I have a passion for reading, and especially for reading books. I think there's a few books out there on these fundamentals of coaching that are really good. I already mentioned Timothy Galway has this incredibly good book called The Inner Game of Tennis. That I would recommend anyone, doesn't matter if you're a coach, just anyone, read that book, especially if you're a manager, read that book once a year at least, or every 6 months. And that's where this idea of coaching as removing interference really comes from. And I think that resonated with me quite deeply. So I absorbed a lot of Timothy Galway's teachings. Then there's others, like the Coaching Habit by Michael Stanier and Effective Modern Coaching by Miles Downey. These are excellent books exactly along the same lines. So I learn a lot from the books. And then what I do is I try to apply as much as possible on the day-to-day. The beautiful thing about being a manager coach is that, if you're a coach, maybe you have a ton of clients. I don't know how many clients you have, Alex, but as a manager coach, you're constantly interacting with people. You're constantly working with your teams. You're constantly doing this on a daily basis. And so you can put a lot of reps in, repetition. You can, one thing that I try to do, not always successfully, is to keep a journal going and to be able to reflect on what I learned and what I went through and what could I have done better and so on and so forth. I say unsuccessfully because it's hard, and I think not everyone can do that naturally. Yeah, and now, you know, again, going back to this, putting in the reps, I've been taking this downtime to, I put a tweet out there, which you probably saw, you know, especially underrepresented groups, if you want to have some free coaching or mentoring, however you want to look at it, during the pandemic. And, you know, I'm sure there's a ton of engineering managers that all of a sudden had their own team, their whole team going remote and are kind of lost, and I wanted to help. And so I also had like learning by doing, essentially, is what I'm talking about. And I try to invest in as many of these relationships as possible. I haven't been turning anyone down, and I do have a number of people already that I'm interacting with and learning a ton from. So yeah, I would say read the basics. To summarize, read the basics, read the fundamentals, drink up the good stuff from the people in the industry, and then practice as much as you can, any way you can put in those reps.
Yeah, and it seems like you're also building in some reflection by journaling and so on.
Exactly, and that would be, I appreciate you saying that. That would be kind of like the third thing, and then reflect on what are you doing, because only by reflecting you can definitely improve.
Yeah. And by the way, just to everybody, the book recommendations are great. I have a paper copy of Inner Game of Tennis, and I just gave it to my singing teacher because I want her to be more of a coach.
More of a coach. Yeah, and I think he has others. Like, I think I didn't read them, but The Inner Game of Stress and The Inner Game of Work. It's also other titles by Timothy Galway. Very easy reads. They're not complicated, you know, complicated prose or anything like that.
Cool. So I guess we're ready to take the questions. So there was another one from Radek. How do you manage to get to the committed actions from the coachee without they knowing there is a coaching happening?
The commitments, committed actions.
Yeah.
I think it's not. So the way I would see it is that I don't think it's the explicit coaching relationship that is necessarily going to elicit the commitment. I think the commitment is not to be coached. The commitment is to improve yourself. And that starts with the commitment to yourself. The drive needs to be yours, and then believe that the manager or the coach is there to support you. And this comes back to what I was saying before about building that trust in that relationship. And I think the coach or the manager or both needs to be clear about expectations. And part of the expectations of the relationship is that, as with any relationship, things would only work if the commitment is there from both sides. The commitment is a broader one, definitely, about improving, as I said, but also a commitment on the micro level in between sessions. For example, if I commit with you as a coach that I will look something up for you, or I will send you something, or, you know, I will dig up this book and I will send it offline. That's something, if I don't follow up on that, your trust in me is going to decrease, and vice versa. So I think it's just setting this expectation that, you know, the former CEO of LinkedIn, Jeff Winner, has this, or maybe it was Satya Nadella that told him from Microsoft, trust equals consistency over time, right? You need to be consistent over time so you can gain the trust. So if we agree that the trust is the fundamental, you know, it's the bedrock of the relationship, then fulfilling multiple commitments over time is the way to get that trust. And if we don't have that trust, then we don't have a relationship, and I cannot help you. So I think it's trying to front load these discussions as much as possible in the beginning of the conversation. I'll give you one example of setting expectations that I've learned how to do out of necessity, you know, with the people that I've been coaching recently, which is, in the initial call, I always ask them, hey, I can take a more directive approach. I can tell you more like, okay, I understand your challenge. Here's what works for me, you know, take it or leave it, but I think you should do this or that. I can take that approach, or I can take a Socratic approach and just be like going all out on question after question after question, and go all the way to the other extreme to really get you to think through everything. I think different people will respond to different things. And by asking the question and setting the groundwork for this earlier on, prevent surprises later on, and you can have a more effective coaching relationship. The commitment is part of that. I'm doing pro bono coaching for the reasons that I already talked about. So I'm a bit lighter on the commitment, to be quite honest, because people, the commitment needs to come kind of naturally from them, because there's not really a lot at stake other than on personal development. So yeah, that's how I would think about commitment, which is an important question, a good question, Alec.
Yeah. If I may piggyback on your answer,
Absolutely.
Paul, sometimes you can be creative with commitment and explore like what you do not do so they are not committing, or what do you do so they are not committing, how you are letting them not to commit, because sometimes we do certain things which detract from the thing that we want to achieve, and sometimes we may not do small things. We're not challenging them when they, for example, didn't do something they say they want to do, or let's say it's related to the dream, so why didn't they follow it? So sometimes it's having this not very easy, not very comfortable conversation with somebody, and not because we blame them.
Absolutely. Again, I don't think coaching is necessarily comfortable. In fact, if you're comfortable all the time, you're not progressing, you're not evolving. And as we discussed in the beginning, coaching is primarily about performance. It's about, on the short and the medium term, get you from level X to level Y in as short a period of time as possible. That doesn't sound as something that should be comfortable. So
yeah. So it's both nurturing and challenging as well.
Absolutely.
Cool. Folks, any other questions? I think I've asked the questions which we had in the chat. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask it. I realize that when you're mentioning these things related to, let's say, coaching philosophy, if we had more time, we will definitely explore it a bit more, because I have some opinions about these things as well. Okay, so it seems like there are no questions at the moment.
That's all right.
So Paulo, how people can learn more about you and what you are up to? I know that you have a newsletter, so maybe you can tell a bit more about it as well.
Yeah. So I think to kind of follow me is literally on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. My handle is PRLA. That's my initials. That comes from a long time back that I never changed. And the newsletter that you're talking about is something that I started earlier this year, about the time when I was finishing my last full-time role. And the idea there was just, I have downtime. I'm sure I'm gonna read a bunch, and I'm gonna listen to a ton of podcasts. And I'm fortunate to come across a lot of good stuff. Why not share it with some friends, right? And so I just started the newsletter literally to share that with friends. What I do is a simple format of 3 articles, 2 podcasts or videos, and 1 book that I recommend. And I write a little bit of a review about, and some comments on the other stuff, a little bit of an intro, and I send that weekly to all my subscribers. Since then, and the publicity of a few folks. But yeah, that's hagakure.substack.com, but it's linked from my Twitter account. Yeah. So you can find all of that stuff there, or LinkedIn, just look me up on LinkedIn. That also works.
Actually, I have a paper copy of Hagakure behind me.
Oh, nice. I would love to see that. Maybe when we're done, you can just show me that offline. I would love to see that. And by the way, I also have a blog. I also have a blog called evolutionarymanager.com, where I write a little bit about engineering management and leadership and some topics around that. So all of what I do is really about trying to help other people like me, and try to get more tech leaders to build more humane workplaces out there. So that's my game. That's my game plan, my mission.
Yeah. And again, I will put everything on notes, and I will send the notes to the participants so that they can follow you, and it would be easier for them not to Google everything.
Yeah.
So the last call for questions. Anything anyone wants to ask? If not, yeah. If not, then I would want to thank you, Paulo. It was really exciting conversation. I will post the recording so that people who didn't join can also check it. It's really, for me, what's interesting is that you're really passionate about this stuff. So even when you're saying that it's not a very structured approach, that you don't know answer to this particular question, I see that you're coming from the right place, and you have this coaching mindset, which then drives your actions as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super passionate about this. I make a ton of mistakes. I have a lot to learn, but one thing I am very, very, very sure about is that tech and products don't build themselves. It's still people doing that. And once I realized that the game is really about how do we get the best out of people, not by wringing them like a towel, you know, but by creating the conditions that brings their best selves to work. And ultimately, if your work life is good, your life at home is probably also going to benefit from that. And I think ultimately we have a better world, and sort of my small contribution is try to do better in that. Yeah. That's where the passion comes from.
I kind of used to think about it in terms of loving your people. Not everybody will like it, but I think when you love your people, they will be coachable.
It's something, it's a good takeaway for me to think about, how if you love your people, they'll be more coachable. It's an interesting one. Thank you for that. No worries. But I definitely think you want to care about your people. If you don't care deeply about your people, they know, and people are not stupid. And sometimes some people think that others are stupid. People are not stupid. People are trying to do their best. People have their hopes and ambitions and restrictions and everything like that. They bring their whole selves to work ultimately. And I think managers of all sorts have a gigantic responsibility in providing for them, and everyone is doing the best that they can.
Yeah. I'm also a little bit enriched after this conversation. So when I go about my managerial stuff, I also have my takeaways as well.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Alex.
Yeah. And just a final announcement I created a free self-paced coaching course. So if anyone is interested, I will share the link in the same notes that I will share with anyone. So if you're interested to learn more, you can kind of go it on your own pace. So I guess that's it for today. Have a nice evening, Paulo. Have a nice evening, everyone. And we'll see you in 2 weeks with the third in the series.
That's good. Thank you, Alex. Thanks everyone. Have a good evening.
Thank you.